Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. Nature and the Nation explores the intersection of national conservatism and philosophical naturalism. This podcast uses the format of a book review to explore philosophy, psychology, history, politics, and sociology through the lens of this exploration, with a particular focus on existentialism, evolutionary psychology, ancient Greece, the American Old Right, and the European New Right. Thank you for tuning in. So for this episode, I will be looking at the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle. Now, if you've tuned into the show before, you know that I have mentioned Aristotle in previous books, particularly in The Cave and the Light, but also, here and there in other books. Aristotle wrote this in the 4th century BC, and so it's been a classic for a very long time. And this kind of, the ethical system that he puts forward in this book is similar to some of the moral foundations theory that we saw in the last book, and some of the kind of balanced out approach that I had been talking about in, when I had spoken of the Greeks and the Greek ethical systems, like in The Greeks by H.D.F. Kiddo, and elsewhere, the sort of kind of evened out approach to ethics that Aristotle puts forward. And so for that reason, I wanted to tackle this book, which really lays out that theory most specifically of all of Aristotle's books. This translation is by David Ross, and it was first published in 1925. It's not considered the most authentic translation. There are other ones that are more literal. This one kind of takes liberties a little bit to make it a little more conversational, which I think is fine. It works well for me and for my purposes. There's a few parts in here I'm going to skip over, as I usually do, and then there are a few parts I want to focus in on in more detail. I'm going to skip over much of the talk of justice. I'm going to skip over much of the talk of friendship. But I'm going to talk about some of the other things that I think are pretty important. I'm actually going to talk about a lot of stuff in here. It's probably going to be a longer podcast, I would imagine, just because there's so much stuff in here that I want to cover. Basically, I'm going to read essentially an entire chapter at a time. The chapters, of course, are not very long. There are a lot of them, and I'm going to just read a whole chapter front to back and then point out some parts in there that I want to draw more specific attention to. And so for that reason, I expect it'll be a longer podcast, but that's okay. It's Aristotle. We might as well dive in. So the first section that I want to read is from Book 1, Chapter 8. And this is when he talks about Eudaimonia, which is really what the book is all about. It's often translated as happiness. It's translated in this book as happiness, but it's also been translated as flourishing. And it's sort of, literally, it's like a good life, a good spirit, or I would say a well-lived life. So an all-around good life, not just, I don't think, happiness. But happiness is certainly a component of it. And he talks about why he kind of breaks it down to happiness as the core good that we're striving after. I'm skipping ahead a little bit here to Chapter 8. I'm skipping over some of his justifications for why he is pursuing eudaimonia. I think we could probably agree that living a good life and a happy life and a flourishing life and a well-lived life are the ends that we're striving for as people. So, in this section, he says, quote, "We must consider happiness in the light not only of our conclusion and our premises, but also of what is commonly said about it. For with a true view all the data harmonize, but with a false one the facts soon clash. Now goods have been divided into 3 classes, and some are described as external, others as relating to soul or to body, We call those that relate to soul most properly and truly goods, and psychical actions and activities we class as relating to soul. Therefore, our accounts must be sound, at least according to this view, which is an old one and agreed on by philosophers. It is correct also in that we identify the end with certain actions and activities, for thus it falls among goods of the soul and not among external goods. Another belief which harmonizes with our account is that the happy man lives well and fares well, for we have practically defined happiness as a sort of living and faring well. The characteristics that are looked for in happiness seem also, all of them, to belong to what we have defined happiness as being. For some identify happiness with virtue, some with practical wisdom, others with a kind of philosophic wisdom, others with these or one of these, accompanied by pleasure or not without pleasure, while others include also external prosperity. Now, some of these views have been held by many men and men of old, and others by a few eminent persons, and it is not probable that either of these should be entirely mistaken, but rather that they should be right in at least some one respect, or even in most respects. With those who identify happiness with virtue, or some one virtue, our account is in harmony, for to virtue belongs virtuous activity. But it makes perhaps no small difference whether we place the chief good in possession or in use, in state of mind or in activity. For the state of mind may exist without producing any good result, as in a man who is asleep or in some other way quite inactive, but the activity cannot, for one who has the activity will of necessity be acting and acting well. And as in the Olympic Games, it is not the most beautiful and the strongest that are crowned, but those who compete, for it is some of these that are victorious. So those who act win, and rightly win, the noble and good things in life. Their life is also in itself pleasant, for pleasure is a state of soul, and to each man that which he is said to be a lover of is pleasant. For example, not only is a horse pleasant to the lover of horses, and a spectacle to the lover of sights, but also in the same way, just acts are pleasant to the lover of justice, and, in general, virtuous acts to the lover of virtue. Now, for most men, their pleasures are in conflict with one another because these are not by nature pleasant, but the lovers of what is noble find pleasant the things that are by nature pleasant. And virtuous actions are such, so that these are pleasant for such men as well as in their own nature. Their life, therefore, has no further need of pleasure as a sort of adventitious charm, but has its pleasure in itself. For besides what we have said, the man who does not rejoice in noble actions is not even good, since no one would call a man just who did not enjoy acting justly, nor any man liberal who did not enjoy liberal actions, and similarly in all other cases. If this is so, virtuous actions must be in themselves pleasant, but they are also good and noble, and have each of these attributes in the highest degree, since the good man judges well about these attributes. His judgment is such as we have described. Happiness, then, is the best, noblest, and most pleasant thing in the world, and these attributes are not severed, as in the inscription at Delos. Most noble is that which is justice, and best is health, but most pleasant it is to win what we love. For all of these properties belong to the best activities, and these, or one, the best of these, we identify with happiness. Yet, evidently, as we said, it needs the external goods as well, for it is impossible, or not easy, to do noble acts without the proper equipment. In many actions we use friends and riches and political power as instruments, and there are some things the lack of which takes the luster from happiness. Good birth, goodly children, beauty. For the man who is very ugly in appearance, or ill-born, or solitary and childless is not very likely to be happy, and perhaps a man would be still less likely if he had thoroughly bad children, or friends, or had lost good children or friends by death. As we said then, happiness seems to need this sort of prosperity in addition, for which reason some identify happiness with good fortune, though others identify it with virtue. End quote. So that is chapter 8 of book 1, when he talks about happiness, aka Eudaimonia. And there's really just one section here I want to draw your attention to, where he says the following quote. He says, "For some identify happiness with virtue, some with practical wisdom, others with a kind of philosophic wisdom, others with these or one of these accompanied by pleasure, or not without pleasure, while others include also external prosperity. Now some of these views have been held by many men and men of old, others by a few eminent persons, and it is not probable that either of these should be entirely mistaken, but rather that they should be right in at least some one respect, or even in most respects." So that is a end quote. So that is a really an interesting sentence there, and I think there's something that we can draw from that, is that he's basically saying, well, some people think that happiness is this, and other people think that happiness is that, but most of these things we can either say that they're often held by many people, or they're held by men of old, or the ancients, or they may be held by a few eminent persons, wise people that we may know, and so it's not probable that all these things are incorrect. It's more likely that at least one is correct, or even maybe they're all correct. So what he's saying is that he's not trying to arrive at a system of happiness or virtue rationally as some constructed system, so much as he's saying, some people say this and some people say that, and if we trust these people to, maybe know what they're talking about, these are esteemed people or people we hold in high regard, or as a very common belief might be held in high regard because it's so common. And so it's very observational and empirical rather than rationalistic and a rule really. I mean, it's rules based, but it's virtue ethics rather than like there being this one core rule, which kind of draws us back to the stuff that we've been talking about previously, and like the last episode with this one focus on the care foundation as like a rule, and the kind of the rationalist delusion that John Haidt pointed out. That's sort of the opposite of Aristotle's approach here, where he's looking at saying, well, some people say this, some people say that. It's probably a little bit of everything. And so it becomes a set of virtues, and he really just kind of observes the world to say, well, how in this circumstance or that circumstance, what do these virtues look like? So that's the basis of virtue ethics and eudaimonia. So I'm going to jump to the next chapter here, which relates to the last one. This is a pretty short chapter here. But in this section he says, quote, "For this reason also the question is asked, whether happiness is to be acquired by learning, or by habituation, or some other sort of training, or comes in virtue of some divine providence, or again by chance. Now if there is any gift of the gods to men, it is reasonable that happiness should be God-given, and most surely God-given of all human things, inasmuch as it is the best. But this question would perhaps be more appropriate to another inquiry. Happiness seems, however, even if it is not God-sent, but comes as a result of virtue in some process of learning or training, to be among the most godlike things. For that which is the prize and end of virtue seems to be the best thing in the world, and something godlike and blessed. It will also, on this view, be very generally shared, for all who are not maimed as regards their potentiality for virtue may win it by a certain kind of study and care. But if it is better to be happy thus than by chance, it is reasonable that the facts should be so, since everything that depends on the action of nature is by nature as good as it can be, and similarly, everything that depends on art or any rational cause, and especially if it depends on the best of all causes. To entrust to chance what is greatest and most noble would be a very defective arrangement. The answer to the question we are asking is plain also from the definition of happiness, for it has been said to be a virtuous activity of soul, of a certain kind. Of the remaining goods, some must necessarily pre-exist as conditions of happiness, and others are naturally cooperative and useful as instruments. And this will be found to agree with what we said at the outset, for we stated the end of political science to be the best end, and political science spends most of its pains on making the citizen to be of a certain character, namely, good and capable of noble acts. It is natural, then, that we call neither ox, nor horse, nor any other of the animals happy, for none of them is capable of sharing in such activity. For this reason also, a boy is not happy, for he is not yet capable of such acts, owing to his age, and boys who are called happy are being congratulated by reason of the hopes we have for them. For there is required, as we said, not only complete virtue, but also a complete life, since many changes occur in life, and all manner of changes, and the most prosperous may fall into great misfortunes in old age, as is told of Priam in the Trojan cycle, and one who has experienced such chances and has ended wretchedly, no one calls happy. End quote. So then that's just a little bit more detail about happiness there. And an interesting point that I wanted to bring your attention to in this chapter was that point at the end there when he says, not only complete virtue, he says, there is required not only complete virtue, but also a complete life, since many changes occur in life, and all manner of chances, and the most prosperous may fall into great misfortunes in old age, as is told of Priam in the Trojan cycle, and one who has experienced such chances and has ended wretchedly, no one calls happy. Just saying that, again, that you have to have a whole complete life to be happy as he defines it. So then I'm going to jump ahead to when he starts talking about the golden mean. Now, he doesn't use the phrase the golden mean. That's something that's been attributed to his philosophy after the fact. But he does talk about the mean as a middle ground, but he's very specific about what he means by the mean. And I think that's probably one of the most interesting parts as well, and I think it meshes well with this whole observational approach that we see that there's a variety of virtues, and how those variety of virtues are dealt with is according to the golden mean. Now, in this section, he says the following. He says, quote, "Since the present inquiry does not aim at theoretical knowledge like the others, for we are inquiring not in order to know what virtue is, but in order to become good, since otherwise our inquiry would have been of no use. We must examine the nature of actions, namely, how we ought to do them. For these determine also the nature of the states of character that are produced, as we have said. Now, that we must act according to the right rule is a common principle, and must be assumed. It will be discussed later, both what the right rule is and how it is related to the other virtues. But this must be agreed upon beforehand, that the whole account of matters of conduct must be given in outline, and not precisely. As we said at the very beginning, that the accounts we demand must be in accordance with the subject matter, matters concerned with conduct, and questions of what is good for us have no fixity any more than matters of health. The general account being of this nature, the account of the particular cases is yet more lacking in exactness, for they do not fall under any art or precept, but the agents themselves must in each case consider what is appropriate to the occasion, as happens also in the art of medicine or of navigation. But though our present account is of this nature, we must give what help we can. First, then, let us consider this, that it is the nature of such things to be destroyed by defects and excess. And we see in the case of strength and of health, for to gain light on things imperceptible, we must use the evidence of sensible things. Exercise, either excessive or defective, destroys the strength. And similarly, drink or food which is above or below a certain amount destroys the health, while that which is proportionate both produces and increases and preserves it. So too is it then in the case of temperance and courage and the other virtues. For the man who flies from and fears everything and does not stand his ground against anything becomes a coward. And the man who fears nothing at all, but goes to meet every danger, becomes rash. And similarly, the man who indulges in every pleasure and abstains from none becomes self-indulgent, while the man who shuns every pleasure, as boors do, becomes in a way insensible. Temperance and courage, then, are both destroyed by excess and defect, and preserved by the mean. But not only are the sources and causes of their origination and growth the same as those of their destruction, but also the sphere of their actualization will be the same, for this is also true of the things which are more evident to sense, such as strength. It is produced by taking much food and undergoing much exertion, and it is the strong man that will be most able to do these things. So too it is with the virtues. By abstaining from pleasures, we become temperate, and it is when we have become so that we are most able to abstain from them, and similarly too in the case of courage, for by being habituated to despise things that are fearful, and to stand our ground against them, we become brave, and it is when we have become so that we shall be most able to stand our ground against them." End quote. All right, so there he's beginning to introduce this mean, and there are a couple parts here that I would like to read. Again, the most crucial section so that we can really get an idea of what we're talking about. The first is this section here when he says, quote, "The whole account of matters of conduct must be given in outline and not precisely. As we said at the very beginning, that the accounts we demand must be in accordance with the subject matter. Matters concerned with conduct and questions of what is good to us, or what is good for us, have no fixity." End quote. So what he's saying there is that some things can't be examined in great detail. He says, the accounts we demand must be in accordance with the subject matter. Right? So the subject matter of virtue doesn't provide precise rules and systems. He says the whole account of matters of conduct must be given in outline and not precisely, because matters are concerned with conduct and questions of what is good for us have no fixity. So these are just like general rules that can be applied, not specific rules. The specific rule would have to be determined by the specific circumstances. And there's not really a capacity to create these sweeping, exact, precise codes of conduct, is what he's saying in that section there. So what we get out of this, and that's like some more of how the virtue ethics works, is what we get out of it are just these approximations. And it's like you're going to have to kind of figure out the details on a case-by-case basis. And then the other part that I want to read is this other section in this chapter. He says, quote, "The man who flies from and fears everything, does not stand his ground against anything, becomes a coward. And the man who fears nothing at all, but goes to meet every danger, becomes rash. And similarly, the man who indulges in every pleasure and abstains from none becomes self-indulgent, while the man who shuns every pleasure, as boors do, becomes in a way insensible. Temperance and courage, then, are destroyed by excess and defect and preserved by the mean." So that's just an example of of how he's got multiple virtues, and each one of them is balanced in accord with the mean, and destroyed if they go too far in either direction. Now, just kind of a real overview of it right there. And then a few chapters later, so that was book 2, chapter 2. I'm going to move now to book 2, chapter 6. He's going into more detail about this same topic here. So in this chapter, he says, quote, "We must not only describe virtue as a state of character, but also say what sort of state it is. We may remark then that every virtue or excellence both brings into good condition the thing of which it is the excellence, and makes the work of that thing be done well. For example, the excellence of the eye makes both the eye and its work good, for it is by the excellence of the eye that we see well. Similarly, the excellence of the horse makes a horse both good in itself and good at running and carrying its rider and awaiting the attack of the enemy. Therefore, if this is true in every case, the virtue of man also will be the state of character which makes a man good and which makes him do his own work well. How is this to happen? We have stated already, but it will be made plain also by the following consideration of the specific nature of virtue. In everything that is continuous and divisible, it is possible to take more, less, or an equal amount, and that either in terms of the thing itself or relatively to us, and the equal is an intermediate between excess and defect. By the intermediate, in the object, I mean that which is equidistant from each of the extremes, which is one and the same for all men. By the intermediate relatively to us, that which is neither too much nor too little, and this is not one nor the same for all. For instance, if 10 is many and 2 is few, 6 is the intermediate, taken in terms of the object, for it exceeds and is exceeded by an equal amount. This is intermediate according to arithmetical proportion. But the intermediate relatively to us is not to be taken so. If 10 pounds are too much for a particular person to eat, and 2 too little, it does not follow that the trainer will order 6 pounds, for this also is perhaps too much for the person who is to take it, or too little. Too little for Milo, a famous athlete, too much for the beginner in athletic exercises. The same is true of running and wrestling. Thus, a master of any art avoids excess and defect, but seeks the intermediate and chooses this, the intermediate, not in the object, but relatively to us. If it is thus, then, that every art does its work well, by looking to the intermediate and judging its works by this standard, so that we often say of good works of art that it is not possible either to take away or to add anything, implying that the excess and defect destroy the goodness of works of art, while the mean preserves it, and good artists, as we say, look to this in their work. And if, further, virtue is more exact and better than any art, as nature also is, then virtue must have the quality of aiming at the intermediate. I mean moral virtue, for it is this that is concerned with passions and actions, and in these there is excess, defect, and the intermediate. For instance, both fear and confidence, and appetite and anger and pity, and in general pleasure and pain, may be felt both too much and too little, and in both cases not well, but to feel them at the right times, with reference to the right objects, toward the right people, with the right motive, and in the right way, is what is both intermediate and best. And this is characteristic of virtue. Similarly, with regard to actions also, there is excess, defect, and the intermediate. Now, virtue is concerned with passions and actions, in which excess is a form of failure and so is defect, while the intermediate is praised and is a form of success. And being praised and being successful are both characteristics of virtue. Therefore, virtue is a kind of mean, since, as we have seen, it aims at what is intermediate. Again, it is possible to fail in many ways, for evil belongs to the class of the unlimited, as the Pythagoreans conjectured, and good to that of limited, while to succeed is possible only in one way, for which reason also one is easy and the other is difficult. To miss the mark, easy; to hit it, difficult. For these reasons also, then, excess and defect are characteristic of vice and the mean of virtue. For men are good in but one way, but bad in many. Virtue, then, is a state of character concerned with choice, lying in a mean relative to us, this being determined by a rational principle, and by that principle by which the man of practical wisdom would determine it. Now it is a mean between two vices, that which depends on excess, that which depends on defect, and again, it is a mean because the vices respectively fall short of or exceed what is right in both passions and actions, while virtue both finds and chooses that which is intermediate. Hence, in respect of what it is, the definition which states its essence, virtue is a mean. But not every action, nor every passion, admits of a mean, for some have names that already imply badness. For example, spite, shamelessness, envy, and in the case of actions, adultery, theft, murder. For all of these and such like things imply by their names that they are themselves bad, and not the excesses or deficiencies of them. It is not possible, then, ever to be right with regard to them. One must always be wrong. Nor does goodness or badness with regard to such things depend on committing adultery with the right woman at the right time and in the right way, but simply to do any of them is to go wrong. It would be equally absurd, then, to expect that in unjust, cowardly, and voluptuous action there should be a mean, an excess, and a deficiency, for at that rate there would be a mean of excess and of deficiency, an excess of excess and a deficiency of deficiency. But as there is no excess and deficiency of temperance and courage, because what is intermediate is, in a sense, extreme, so too of the actions we have mentioned, there is no mean nor any excess and deficiency. But however they are done, they are wrong. For in general, there is neither a mean of excess and deficiency, nor excess and deficiency of a mean. End quote. So the general point that he's getting at there, in that last part, is that there are some things that are just wrong, and there's no attempt to find a balance in them, like spite or murder or whatever. These things, they're just by definition bad, and so you want a total deficiency. You don't want a little bit. So the parts in there that I wanted to read, actually, there were two of them. The first one was both fear, quote, both fear and confidence and appetite and anger and pity, and in general, pleasure and pain, may be felt both too much and too little, and in both cases not well. But to feel them at the right times, with reference to the right objects, toward the right people, with the right motive, and in the right way, it is what is both intermediate and best, and this is characteristic of virtue. End quote. So in that part, he's basically saying that each virtue has a whole host of possibilities of how it could be applied. And it's circumstantial, that it's in this particular scenario where this virtue is being tested or what have you, it has to be applied correctly according to all of the different particulars of the circumstances in which it finds itself. So you want to have confidence at the right time. You want to have confidence in the right circumstance, toward the right object, with the right motive. All of those things Now that's still a pretty big question mark. How do we know when the right time is? And he gets into that in here as well. But essentially, it's virtue applied correctly. Then the other part that I wanted to read was where he says, quote, "Virtue then is a state of character concerned with choice, lying in a mean relative to us, this being determined by a rational principle, and by that principle by which the man of practical wisdom would determine it." So then end quote. So what he's saying here is that you determine what the right time and place is. You determine where the intermediate is through a rational principle. Okay, what is the rational principle? He says, by that principle by which the man of practical wisdom would determine it. So you're looking for a man of practical wisdom to give you this rational principle. Aristotle's not going to give you this rational principle. It's kind of like he says here, this is all determined by reason, as would be determined by a wise person. So again, that's he kind of dodges the point, but he makes it very particular. Like, if there was a person of practical wisdom in the circumstance giving you advice, what would that person say? That's kind of what he says. It just really keeps it very specific like that. So that was Book 2, Chapter 6. And then I want to read Book 2, Chapter 9 as well. He's talking a little bit more about the mean. And he says in this chapter, quote, "that moral virtue is a mean, and in what sense it is so, and that it is a mean between two vices, the one involving excess, the other deficiency, and that it is such because its character is to aim as what is intermediate, in passions and in actions, has been sufficiently stated. Hence, also, it is no easy task to be good, for in everything it is no easy task to find the middle. For example, to find the middle of a circle is not for everyone, but for him who knows. So, too, anyone can get angry. That is easy. Or give or spend money. But to do this to the right person, to the right extent, at the right time, with the right motive, and in the right way, that is not for everyone, nor is it easy. Wherefore goodness is both rare and laudable and noble. Hence, he who aims at the intermediate must first depart from what is the more contrary to it. As Calypso advises, hold the ship out beyond that surf and spray. For of the extremes, one is more erroneous, one less so. Therefore, since to hit the mean it is hard in the extreme, we must, as a second best, as people say, take the least of the evils. And this will be done best in the way we describe. But we must consider the things toward which we ourselves also are easily carried away. For some of us tend to one thing, some to another, and this will be recognizable from the pleasure and pain we feel. We must drag ourselves away to the contrary extreme, for we shall get into the intermediate state by drawing well away from error, as people do in straightening sticks that are bent. Now in everything, the pleasant or pleasure is most to be guarded against, for we do not judge it impartially. We ought then to feel toward pleasure as the elders of the people felt toward Helen, and in all circumstances repeat their saying, for if we dismiss pleasure, thus we are less likely to go astray. It is by doing this, then, to sum the matter up, that we shall best be able to hit the mean. But this is no doubt difficult, and especially in individual cases, for it is not easy to determine both how and with whom and on what provocation and how long one should be angry. For we too sometimes praise those who fall short and call them good-tempered, but sometimes we praise those who get angry and call them manly. The man, however, who deviates little from goodness is not blamed, whether he do so in the direction of the more or of the less, but only the man who deviates more widely, for he does not fail to be noticed. But up to what point, and to what extent a man must deviate before he becomes blameworthy, is not an easy thing to determine by reasoning, any more than anything else that is perceived by the senses. Such things depend on particular facts, and the decision rests with perception. So much then is plain that the intermediate state is in all things to be praised, but that we must incline sometimes towards the excess, sometimes towards the deficiency, for so we shall most easily hit the mean and what is right." End quote. So he's talking about how to hit the mean. He says, well, the first thing to do in trying to hit the mean is to avoid the excess and defect. So the more you kind of attempt to stay away from any sort of extremes, the more likely you are to find that intermediate. So that's at a basic level. He says that's like the lesser of two evils, is to avoid. And he also says that there's going to be one between excess and deficiency, one or the other of these with respect to any particular virtue is going to be the more pleasurable or the easier, the one to which we will incline. And you need to strive toward the opposite one. So that's why he kind of speaks against living in accord to pleasure, but living against pleasure. He says that's difficult. It's not easy to live against pleasure. But pleasure is, if we follow pleasure, it's more likely that will lead us toward the extreme, or toward one of the extremes. He says, quote, "Now in everything the pleasant or pleasure is most to be guarded against, for we do not judge it impartially. We ought then to feel toward pleasure as the elders of the people felt toward Helen, and in all circumstances repeat their saying, for if we dismiss pleasure, then we are less likely to go astray. It is by doing this, to sum the matter up, that we shall best be able to hit the mean." End quote. Basically, don't do things the easy way, because that will lead you to some degree of excess or deficiency. So then he talks about some of the specific virtues now that he's gone over the mean in such detail. He goes over some of the specific virtues that he's talking about, and I don't want to talk about all of them. Like I said, I'm going to skip over a few. There's a lot of good stuff here. He talks about self-control, self-restraint. I'm going to talk about a few of them that kind of struck me as being pertinent to some of the things we've been talking about. Actually, a lot of it is pertinent, but I'm going to talk here about courage. So he says, quote, "Let us speak of courage. That it is a mean with regard to feelings of fear and confidence has already been made evident. And plainly the things we fear are fearful things. And these are, to speak without qualification, evils, for which reason people even define fear as expectation of evil. Now we fear all evils. For example, disgrace, poverty, disease, friendlessness, death. But the brave man is not thought to be concerned with all, for to fear some things is even right and noble, and it is base not to fear them. For example, disgrace. He who fears this is good and modest. He who does not is shameless. He is, however, by some people called brave, by a transference of the word to a new meaning. For he has in him something which is like the brave man, since the brave man also is a fearless person. Poverty and disease we perhaps ought not to fear, nor in general the things that do not proceed from vice and are not due to a man himself. But not even the man who is fearless of these is brave. Yet we apply the word to him also in virtue of a similarity. For some who, in the dangers of war, are cowards, are liberal, and are confident in the face of the loss of money. Nor is a man a coward if he fears insult to his wife and children, or envy, or anything of the kind, nor brave if he is confident when he is about to be flogged. With what sort of fearful things, then, is the brave man concerned? Surely with the greatest, for no one is more likely than he to stand his ground against what is awe-inspiring. Now, death is the most fearful of all things, for it is the end, and nothing is thought to be any longer either good or bad for the dead. But the brave man would not seem to be concerned even with death in all circumstances, for example at sea or in disease. In what circumstances, then? Surely in the noblest. Now such deaths are those in battle, for these take place in the greatest and noblest danger. And these are correspondingly honored in city-states and at the courts of monarchs. Properly, then, he will be called brave who is fearless in face of a noble death, and of all emergencies that involve death, and the emergencies of war are the highest degree of this kind. Yet at sea also, and in disease, the brave man is fearless, but not in the same way as the seaman, for he has given up hope of safety, and is disliking the thought of death in this shape, while they are hopeful because of their experience. At the same time, we show courage in situations where there is the opportunity of showing prowess, or where death is noble, but in these forms of death, neither of these conditions is fulfilled. End quote. So that's Book 3, Chapter 6, when he talks about courage. So what I wanted to bring your attention to in this chapter is just the basic line toward the end when he says, "He will be called brave, who is fearless in face of a noble death, and of all emergencies that involve death. And the emergencies of war are in the highest degree of this kind." So essentially, bravery really belongs to the warrior more than anyone else, and it belongs to the facing of death nobly. To die, to face your death in a noble manner, and to deal with death fearlessly. So then I want to go on to the following chapter, which is Book 3, Chapter 7. He's still talking about courage. In this section, he says, quote, "What is fearful is not the same for all men, but we say there are things fearful even beyond human strength. These, then, are fearful to everyone, at least to every sensible man. But the fearful things that are not beyond human strength differ in magnitude and degree, and so too do the things that inspire confidence. Now the brave man is as dauntless as man may be. Therefore, while he will fear even the things that are not beyond human strength, he will face them as he ought, and as the rule directs, for honor's sake. For this is the end of virtue. But it is possible to fear these more or less, and again to fear things that are not fearful as if they were. Of the faults that are committed, one consists in fearing what we should not, another in fearing as we should not, another in fearing when we should not, and so on, and so too with respect to the things that inspire confidence. The man, then, who faces and who fears the right things, and from the right motive, in the right way and at the right time, and who feels confidence under the corresponding conditions, is brave. For the brave man feels and acts according to the merits of the case, and in whatever way the rule directs. Now the end of every activity is conformity to the corresponding state of character. This is true, therefore, of the brave man as well as others, but courage is noble. Therefore the end is also noble, for each thing is defined by its end. Therefore it is for a noble end that the brave man endures and acts as courage directs. Of those who go to excess, he who exceeds in fearlessness has no name. We have said previously that many states of character have no names. But he would be a sort of madman or insensitive to pain if he feared nothing, neither earthquakes nor the waves, as they say the Celts do not. While the man who exceeds in confidence about what really is fearful is rash. The rash man, however, is also thought to be boastful, and only a pretender to courage. At all events, As the brave man is with regard to what is fearful, so the rash man wishes to appear, and so he imitates him in situations where he can. Hence, also most of them are a mixture of rashness and cowardice, for while in these situations they display confidence, they do not hold their ground against what is really fearful. The man who exceeds in fear is a coward, for he fears both what he ought not and as he ought not, and all the similar characterizations attached to him. He is lacking also in confidence, but he is more conspicuous for his excess of fear in painful situations. The coward, then, is a despairing sort of person, for he fears everything. The brave man, on the other hand, has the opposite disposition, for confidence is the mark of a hopeful disposition. The coward, the rash man, and the brave man, then, are concerned with the same objects, but are differently disposed toward them, for the first two exceed and fall short, while the third holds the middle, which is the right position, and rash men are precipitate and wish for dangers beforehand but draw back when they are in them, while brave men are excited in the moment of action but collected beforehand. As we have said, then, courage is a mean with respect to things that inspire confidence or fear, in the circumstances that have been stated, and it chooses or endures things because it is noble to do so, or because it is base not to do so. But to die to escape from poverty, or love, or anything painful, is not the mark of a brave man, but rather of a coward, for it is softness to fly from what is troublesome, and such a man endures death not because it is noble, but to fly from evil." End quote. So that was the section where he goes into more detail about the specifics about bravery, and the part in there that I wanted to read was, well, there were a couple of them. That one, that was chapter 7, book 3, chapter 7, and the parts that I wanted to read were the part where he says, "The man," quote, "the man then who faces and who fears the right things and from the right motive, in the right way and at the right time, and who feels confidence under the corresponding conditions, is brave, for the brave man feels and acts according to the merits of the case and whatever way the rule directs." Now, I know that's kind of getting repetitive, but I wanted to point out that he makes that an important part of his entire theory. He comes back to it periodically. The circumstantial nature of it, to approach the things that would cause you fear, that should cause you fear, or that should not cause you fear, and to approach them in the correct manner. All those different parts of it. It just kind of continues to break down into a variety of details, like goodness breaks down and happiness breaks down into this variety of virtues, and each virtue kind of breaks down into a variety of circumstantial conditions. And the other part that I wanted to draw attention to is where he says, quote, "Courage is a mean with respect to things that inspire confidence or fear, in the circumstances that have been stated, and it chooses or endures things because it is noble to do so, or because it is base not to do so." Because he's saying here that the reason that someone acts brave and to find the right amount, the kind of measure that you use to find the right amount, is to do so to achieve a noble, a bravery that tilts toward nobleness, because it is noble to be brave. And because it is base not to do so. So that's kind of your motivation, and it's also a mechanism for finding what is the brave course of action. And so then, moving right along, he gets, in this next section, to talking about pride. Now, the word that he uses is megasukia, which is like mega meaning great, and sukia meaning like psyche or soul. So great soul, greatness of soul is how it is most often translated. I like this translation of pride because greatness of soul is not a concept that we normally deal with in the English language and so it's kind of maybe hard to latch onto. Pride's not a perfect translation, just like happiness isn't a perfect translation of eudaimonia. Sometimes I wish they would just use the original Greek words. But either way, pride probably comes closest to it, and it kind of drives home the point that I'm trying to make here. So I'm going to use the word pride. But so in this section, essentially he says, quote, "So greatness of soul, or pride, seems even from its name to be concerned with great things. What sort of great things is the first question we must try to answer. It makes no difference whether we consider the state of character or the man characterized by it. Now the man is thought to be proud when he thinks himself worthy of great things, being worthy of them. For he who does so beyond his deserts is a fool, but no virtuous man is foolish or silly. The proud man, then, is the man we have described. For he who is worthy of little and thinks himself worthy of little is temperate, but not proud. For pride implies greatness, as beauty implies a good-sized body, and little people may be neat and well-proportioned, but cannot be beautiful. On the other hand, he who thinks himself worthy of great things, being unworthy of them, is vain, though not everyone who thinks himself worthy of more than he really is worthy of is vain. The man who thinks himself worthy of less than he is really worthy of is unduly humble, whether his deserts be great or moderate, or his deserts be small, but his claims yet smaller. And the man whose deserts are great would seem most unduly humble. For what would he have done if they had been less? The proud man, then, is an extreme in respect to the greatness of his claims, but a man in respect of the rightness of them. For he claims what is in accordance with his merits, while the others go to excess or fall short. If then he deserves and claims great things, and above all the greatest things, he will be concerned with one thing in particular. Desert is relative to external goods, and the greatest of these, we should say, is that which we render to the gods, and which people of position most aim at, and which is the prize appointed for the noblest deeds, and this is honor. That is surely the greatest of external goods. Honors and dishonors, therefore, are the objects with respect to which the proud man is as he should be. And even apart from argument, it is with honor that proud men appear to be concerned, for it is honor that they chiefly claim, but in accordance with their deserts. The unduly humble man falls short, both in comparison with his own merits and in comparison with the proud man's claims. The vain man goes to excess in comparison with his own merits, but does not exceed the proud man's claims. Now the proud man, since he deserves most, must be good in the highest degree, for the better man always deserves more, and the best man most. Therefore, the truly proud man must be good, and greatness in every virtue would seem to be characteristic of a proud man. And it would be most unbecoming for a proud man to fly from danger, swinging his arms by his sides, or to wrong another. For to what end should he do disgraceful acts, he to whom nothing is great? If we consider him point by point, we shall see the utter absurdity of a proud man who is not good. Nor, again, would he be worthy of honor if he were bad, for honor is the prize of virtue, and it is to the good that it is rendered. Pride, then, seems to be a sort of crown of the virtues, for it makes them greater, and it is not found without them. Therefore it is hard to be truly proud, for it is impossible without nobility and goodness of character. It is chiefly with honors and dishonors, then, that the proud man is concerned. and at honors that are great and conferred by good men he will be moderately pleased, thinking that he is coming by his own, or even less than his own, for there can be no honor that is worthy of perfect virtue, and yet he will at any rate accept it, since they have nothing greater to bestow on him. But honor from casual people and on trifling grounds he will utterly despise, since it is not this that he deserves, and dishonor too, since in his case it cannot be just. In the first place, then, as has been said, the proud man is concerned with honors, yet he will also bear himself with moderation towards wealth and power and all good or evil fortune, whatever may befall him, and will never be overjoyed by good fortune nor overpained by evil. For not even toward honor does he bear himself as if it were a very great thing. Power and wealth are desirable for the sake of honor, at least those who have them wish to get honor by means of them. And for him to whom even honor is a little thing, the others must be so too. Hence, proud men are thought to be disdainful. The gods of fortune also are thought to contribute toward pride. For men who are well born are thought worthy of honor. And so are those who enjoy power or wealth, for they are in a superior position, and everything that has a superiority in something good is held in great honor. Hence even such things make men prouder, for they are honored by some for having them. The goods of fortune also are thought to contribute towards pride, for men who are well born are thought worthy of honor, and so are those who enjoy power or wealth, for they are in a superior position, and everything that has a superiority in something good is held in great honor. Hence, even such things make men prouder, for they are honored by some for having them. But in truth, the good man alone is to be honored, for he, however, who has both advantages is thought the more worthy of honor. But those who without virtue have such goods are neither justified in making great claims, nor entitled to the name of proud, for these things imply perfect virtue. Disdainful and insolent, however, even those who have such goods become. For without virtue it is not easy to bear gracefully the goods of fortune, and being unable to bear them, and thinking themselves superior to others, they despise others, and themselves do what they please. They imitate the proud man without being like him, and this they do where they can, for they do not act virtuously, but they do despise others. For the proud man despises justly, since he thinks truly, but the many do so at random. He does not run into trifling dangers, nor is he fond of danger, because he honors few things, but he will face great dangers, and when he is in danger, he is unsparing of his life, knowing that there are conditions on which life is not worth having. And he is the sort of man to confer benefits, but he is ashamed of receiving them, for the one is the mark of a superior, the other an inferior. And he is apt to confer greater benefits in return, for thus the original benefactor, besides being paid, will incur a debt to him, and will be the gainer by the transaction. They seem also to remember any service they have done, but not those they have received. For he who receives a service is inferior to him who has done it, but the proud man wishes to be superior, and to hear of the former with pleasure, of the latter with displeasure. This, it seems, is why Thetis did not mention to Zeus the services she had done him, and why the Spartans did not recount their services to the Athenians, but those they had received. It is a mark of the proud man also to ask for nothing, or scarcely anything, but to give help readily, and to be dignified toward people who enjoy high position and good fortune, but unassuming toward those of the middle class, for it is a difficult and lofty thing to be superior to the former, but easy to be so to the latter. And a lofty bearing over the former is no mark of ill breeding, but among humble people it is as vulgar as a display of strength against the weak. Again, it is characteristic of the proud man not to aim at the things commonly held in honor, or the things in which others excel, to be sluggish and to hold back except where great honor or a great work is at stake, and to be a man of few deeds, but of great and notable ones. He must also be open in his hate and in his love, for to conceal one's feelings, i.e., to care less for truth than for what people will think, is a coward's part, and must speak and act openly, for he is free of speech, because he is contemptuous, and he is given to telling the truth, except when he speaks in irony to the vulgar. He must be unable to make his life revolve round another, unless it be a friend, for this is slavish, and for this reason all flatterers are servile, and people lacking in self-respect are flatterers. Nor is he given to admiration, for nothing to him is great. Nor is he mindful of wrongs, for it is not the part of a proud man to have a long memory, especially for wrongs, but rather to overlook them. Nor is he a gossip, for he will speak neither about himself nor about another, since he cares not to be praised, nor for others to be blamed. Nor again is he given to praise, and for the same reason he is not an evil speaker, even about his enemies, except from haughtiness. With regard to necessary or small matters, he is least of all men given to lamentation or the asking of favors, for it is the part of one who takes such matters seriously to behave so with respect to them. He is one who will possess beautiful and profitless things rather than profitable and useful ones, for this is more proper to a character that suffices to itself. Further, a slow step is thought proper to the proud man, a deep voice, and a level utterance, for the man who takes few things seriously is not likely to be hurried, nor the man who thinks nothing great to be excited, while a shrill voice and a rapid gait are the results of hurry and excitement. Such, then, is the proud man. The man who falls short of him is unduly humble, and the man who goes beyond him is vain. Now these two are not thought to be bad, for they are not evildoers, but only mistaken. For the unduly humble man, being worthy of good things, robs himself of what he deserves, and seems to have something bad about him, from the fact that he does not think himself worthy of good things, and seems also not to know himself, else he would have desired the things he was worthy of, since these were good. Yet such people are not thought to be fools, but rather unduly retiring. Such an estimate, however, seems actually to make them worse, for each class of people aims at what corresponds to its worth, and these people stand back even from noble actions and undertakings, deeming themselves unworthy, and from external goods no less. Vain people, on the other hand, are fools, and ignorant of themselves, and that manifestly. For not being worthy of them, they attempt honorable undertakings, and then are found out. And they adorn themselves with clothing and outward show and such things, and wish their strokes of good fortune to be made public, and speak about them as if they would be honored for them. But undue humility is more opposed to pride than vanity is, for both it is commoner and worse. Pride, then, is concerned with honor on the grand scale, as has been said. End quote. So there you have the main section where he introduces pride, or greatness of soul, as it is more accurately translated. I like that section. I think it's long. It's one of the longer chapters, but it's interesting. Now, what of there did I want to bring your attention to? A couple points. The first one is just early on. It's just a short phrase where he says, "The man is thought to be proud who thinks himself worthy of great things, being worthy of them." So it's a necessary matching of first being worthy of great things, to have accomplished that, and then to consider yourself worthy of the great things for which you're worthy. So he calls pride sort of the crown of the virtues, because all the other virtues are necessary for one to be justly proud. Because to be proud of oneself without being justly proud or appropriately proud is vain, and to not be proud enough is unduly humble and kind of diminishing. So there's that kind of synchronicity that's necessary there. Yeah, what he describes as the proud man there kind of has a kingly nature to him. He sort of seems like the pinnacle of virtue to achieve this greatness of soul. The other part that I wanted to read to you here was when he said, quote, "If we consider him point by point, we shall see the utter absurdity of a proud man who is not good. Nor again would he be worthy of honor if he were bad, for honor is the prize of virtue, and it is to the good that it is rendered. Pride then seems to be a sort of crown of the virtues, for it makes them greater, and it is not found without them. Therefore it is hard to be truly proud, for it is impossible without nobility and goodness of character. It is chiefly with honors and dishonors, then, that the proud man is concerned." So that kind of reiterates, end quote, that kind of reiterates what I had said previously. And yeah, honors and dishonors are what, and that sort of was also what he was saying about courage, was that courage was based on doing the honorable or the noble task. So nobility and honor are sort of guides for courage and for pride. And then I'm going to jump ahead here a little bit to he starts. So there's like those are some of the earlier virtues, and then he starts to get into the philosophical virtues a little bit later on. And this is the section when he talks about judgment and intuition. So in this section, he says, quote, "What is called judgment, in virtue of which men are said to be sympathetic judges, and to have judgment, is the right discrimination of the equitable. This is shown by the fact that we say the equitable man is above all others a man of sympathetic judgment, and identify equity with sympathetic judgment about certain facts. And sympathetic judgment is judgment which discriminates what is equitable and which does so correctly. And correct judgment is that which judges what is true." Now all the states we have considered converge, as might be expected, to the same point. For when we speak of judgment and understanding and practical wisdom and intuitive reason, we credit the same people with possessing judgment and having reached years of reason, and with having practical wisdom and understanding. For all these faculties deal with ultimates, i.e. with particulars. And being a man of understanding and of good or sympathetic judgment consists in being able to judge about the things with which practical wisdom is concerned. For the equities are common to all good men in relation to other men. Now all things which have to be done are included among particulars or ultimates. For not only must the man of practical wisdom know particular facts, but understanding and judgment are also concerned with things to be done, and these are ultimates. And intuitive reason is concerned with the ultimates in both directions, for both the first terms and the last are objects of intuitive reason and not of argument. And the intuitive reason, which is presupposed by demonstrations, grasps the unchangeable in first terms, while the intuitive reason involved in practical reasoning grasps the last and variable fact, i.e. the minor premise. For these variable facts are the starting points for the apprehension of the end, since the universals are reached from the particulars. Of these, therefore, we must have perception, and this perception is intuitive reason. This is why these states are thought to be natural endowments. Why, while no one is thought to be a philosopher by nature, people are thought to have by nature judgment, understanding, and intuitive reason. This is shown by the fact that we think our powers correspond to our time of life, and that our particular age brings with it intuitive reason and judgment. This implies that nature is the cause. Hence, intuitive reason is both beginning and end, for demonstrations are from these and about these. And therefore we ought to attend to the undemonstrated sayings and opinions of experienced and older people, or of people of practical wisdom, not less than to the demonstrations. For because experience has given them an eye, they see aright. We have stated then what practical and philosophic wisdom are, and with what each of them is concerned, and we have said that each is the virtue of a different part of the soul. End quote. He says, quote, the part I wanted to draw your attention to here is when he says, quote, these states are thought to be natural endowments. Why, while no one is thought to be a philosopher by nature, people are thought to have, by nature, judgment, understanding, and intuitive reason. This is shown by the fact that we think our powers correspond to our time of life, and that a particular age brings with it intuitive reason and judgment. This implies that nature is the cause. End quote. So he's really putting forward just the idea that we have in these intuitive capacities, which I wanted to draw attention to because that's so much of the argument that I've been making in previous books about our intuitive understanding of morality and our intuitive reasoning and our intuitive rationality and things like that. So then one more section about practical wisdom. Practical wisdom is really like the ability to apply the principles of the universals to the particulars. So this is now in book 6. Chapter 13. He says, quote, we must therefore consider virtue also once more, for virtue too is similarly related, as practical wisdom is to cleverness, not the same but like it. So is natural virtue to virtue in the strict sense. For all men think that each type of character belongs to its possessors in some sense by nature. For from the very moment of birth we are just, or fitted for self-control, or brave, or have the other moral qualities. But yet we seek something else, as that which is good in the strict sense. We seek for the presence of such qualities in another way. For both children and brutes have the natural dispositions to these qualities, but without reason these are evidently hurtful. Only we seem to see this much, that while one may be led astray by them, as a strong body which moves without sight may stumble badly because of its lack of sight, still if a man once acquires reason, that makes a difference in action, and his state, while still like what it was, will then be virtue in the strict sense. Therefore, as in the part of us which forms opinions, there are two types, cleverness and practical wisdom. So too, in the moral part there are two types, natural virtue and virtue in the strict sense, and of these the latter involves practical wisdom. This is why some say that all the virtues are forms of practical wisdom, and why Socrates in one respect was on the right track, while in another he went astray. In thinking that all the virtues were forms of practical wisdom, he was wrong. But in saying they implied practical wisdom, he was right. This is confirmed by the fact that even now all men, when they define virtue, after naming the state of character and its object, add, that state which is in accordance with the right rule. Now, the right rule is that which is in accordance with practical wisdom. All men then seem somehow to divine that this kind of state is virtue. namely that which is in accordance with practical wisdom. But we must go a little further. For it is not merely the state in accordance with the right rule, but that the state that implies the presence of the right rule, that is virtue. And practical wisdom is a right rule about such matters. Socrates then thought the virtues were rules or rational principles, for he thought they were, all of them, forms of scientific knowledge, while we think they involve a rational principle. It is clear then from what has been said that it is not possible to be good in the strict sense without practical wisdom, or practically wise without moral virtue. But in this way we may also refute the dialectical argument whereby it might be contended that the virtues exist in separation from each other. The same man, it might be said, is not best equipped by nature for all the virtues, so that he will have already acquired one when he has not yet acquired another. This is possible in respect of the natural virtues, but not in respect of those in respect of which a man is called, without qualification, good. For with the presence of the one quality, practical wisdom will be given all the virtues. And it is plain that, even if it were of no practical value, we should have needed it, because it is the virtue of the part of us in question. Plain, too, that the choice will not be right without practical wisdom any more than without virtue. For the one determines the end, and the other makes us do the things that lead to the end. But again, it is not supreme over philosophic wisdom, in other words, over the superior part of us, any more than the art of medicine is over health, for it does not use it, but provides for its coming into being. It issues orders, then, for its sake, but not to it. Further, to maintain its supremacy would be like saying that the art of politics rules the gods, because it issues orders about all the affairs of the state. End quote. So that's a bit of a trickier section there. This is Book 6, Chapter 13, and he's talking about right rule, and he ends that saying that it's not supreme. This practical wisdom that he's talking about is not supreme over philosophic wisdom, because philosophic wisdom is more like the Platonic form of wisdom. It is the pure quest for truth. Practical wisdom is like the application of wisdom in the world. Then I wanted to jump ahead to Book 10, Chapter 6. And at this point, he kind of starts wrapping this all up and brings it back to happiness, or eudaimonia. And so in this part, he says, quote, "Now that we have spoken of the virtues, the forms of friendship, and the varieties of pleasure, what remains is to discuss in outline the nature of happiness, since this is what we state the end of human affairs to be. Our discussion will be the more concise if we first sum up what we have already said. We said then that it is not a state, for if it were, it might belong to someone who was asleep throughout his life, living the life of a plant, or again to someone who was suffering the greatest misfortunes. If these implications are unacceptable, and we must rather class happiness as an activity, as we have said before, and if some activities are necessary and desirable for the sake of something else, while others are so in themselves, evidently happiness must be placed among those desirable in themselves, not among those desirable for the sake of something else. For happiness does not lack anything, but is self-sufficient. Now those activities are desirable in themselves, from which nothing is sought beyond the activity. And of this nature, virtuous actions are thought to be, for to do noble and good deeds is a thing desirable for its own sake. Pleasant amusements also are thought to be of this nature. We choose them not for the sake of other things, for we are injured rather than benefited by them, since we are led to neglect our bodies and our property. But most of the people who are deemed happy take refuge in such pastimes, which is the reason why those who are ready-witted at them are highly esteemed at the courts of tyrants. They make themselves pleasant companions in the tyrant's favorite pursuits, and that is the sort of man they want. Now these things are thought to be of the nature of happiness, because people in despotic positions spend their leisure in them. But perhaps such people prove nothing, for virtue and reason, from which good activities flow, do not depend on despotic position. Nor if these people, who have never tasted pure and generous pleasure, take refuge in the bodily pleasures, should these, for that reason, be thought more desirable. For boys, too, think the things that are valued among themselves are the best. It is to be expected, then, that as different things seem valuable to boys and to men, so they should be to bad men and to good. Now, as we have often maintained, these things are both valuable and pleasant, which are such to the good man, and to each man the activity in accordance with his own state is most desirable, and therefore to the good man that which is in accordance with virtue. Happiness, therefore, does not lie in amusement. It would indeed be strange if the end were amusement, and one were to take trouble and suffer hardship all one's life in order to amuse oneself. For, in a word, everything that we choose for the sake of something else, except happiness, which is an end. Now, to exert oneself and work for the sake of amusement seems silly and utterly childish, but to amuse oneself, in order that one may exert oneself, as Anacharsis puts it, seems right, for amusement is a sort of relaxation, and we need relaxation, because we cannot work continuously. Relaxation, then, is not an end, for it is taken for the sake of activity. The happy life is thought to be virtuous. Now, a virtuous life requires exertion, and does not consist in amusement. And we say that serious things are better than laughable things, and those connected with amusement, and that the activity of the better of any two things, whether it be two elements of our being, or two men, is the more serious, but the activity of the better is ipso facto superior, and more of the nature of happiness. And any chance person can enjoy the bodily pleasures no less than the best man. But no one assigns to a slave a share in happiness, unless he assigns to him also a share in human life. For happiness does not lie in such occupations, but as we have said before, in virtuous activities. End quote. So, this is kind of he provides a bit of a summary of happiness and its relation to the virtues. And there are two parts here I want to mention when he says, we must class happiness as an activity, as we have said before, and if some activities are necessary and desirable for the sake of something else, while others are so in themselves, evidently happiness must be placed among those desirable in themselves, not among those desirable for the sake of something else. For happiness does not lack anything but is self-sufficient. End quote. So that part there is just where he's basically saying that everything we pursue is for the sake of something else, except for happiness, which we pursue for its own sake. Even virtue we pursue because we want to be happy. Nobility and everything else, honors, that we seek. We seek these things because we want to achieve eudaimonia, really, more than happiness. Because, again, that's a little deceiving to use the word happiness there, when what he's really talking about is flourishing. I like the translation of flourishing for eudaimonia. But it's the end to which all things aim. And then the other short section here, the sentence toward the end when he says the happy life is thought to be virtuous. Now, a virtuous life requires exertion and does not consist in amusement. Amusement is not the basis of why we are happy. We are happy by doing good deeds, basically by pursuing virtue, by acting in a virtuous manner. Our virtuous actions bring us happiness. So that will bring us to the end of Aristotle. It's been a long episode. I read an awful lot of these chapters, and I skipped over a lot as well. He kind of takes an approximate view, sort of like the pragmatic view that I had mentioned in the book Pragmatism by William James, where it's sort of an approximate approach to virtue because it is based on perception and sensation, and that was one of the early things that he had mentioned. And so there's a sort of a intuitive nature to virtuous behavior, but it's not totally uncategorizable. It's not as though reason cannot look at virtue and discern one form of virtue from another. And there are a number of virtues that he highlights that I think are like heroic. They call back to a sort of a heroic era, and they're about manliness, like courage. The word courage, when I was talking about that section, the Greek word could also be translated as manliness. And he talks about temperance as well. There were a lot of parts about balance and self-restraint and not going too far in any direction. Obviously, there's parts of that in the whole premise of the mean and the extremes, the excess and the deficit, but also as a specific virtue of temperance, sort of. So all these virtues that kind of hold important parts in the whole scheme, the pride being sort of the crowning virtue, and then the temperance being the mechanism by which all of the virtues avoid the extremes, and reason and rationality and wisdom and everything else. I like it. It's a cool system, and it's super old school, obviously. 400 or the 300s, the 4th century BC was when Aristotle lived, and he has influenced philosophy quite a bit from then till now. So that will be all for this week. Come back next time for some more cool book reviews. Bye.